The letter arrived without a stamp, left on a doorstep no one else could find. A broken veteran, a loyal canine, and a house carved into a mountain that had been sealed for decades. What began as an inheritance quickly became a warning, because something beneath that mountain was still alive, and someone was trying to silence it. As the storms came and the ground began to breathe, a man who thought his life was already over was forced to choose between walking away or becoming a guardian again. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Durango, Colorado. In mid-July doesn't burn the way deserts do. It bakes with altitude, a dry, bright heat that turns the sky into a hard blue lid and pulls every hint of moisture out of skin and asphalt alike. By late afternoon, the mountains sit sharp on the horizon, dark green and indifferent, while the town below hums with pickup trucks, dust, and the steady churn of summer tourists who don't notice how quickly a storm can form up high and crash down into the valleys. The sun had been on the road all day when Graham Kincaid stepped onto the shoulder of US 160 with a shovel in his hands and a dull ache behind his eyes that never really left. He wasn't old, 38 by the date on his license, but he carried himself like a man who had learned to live with weight, squared shoulders, a tight jaw, movements economical and unshowy. His hair was cut short and dark, already thinning a little at the temples. The stubble along his cheeks and chin was the rough kind that came back fast, even when he shaved every morning. There was a faint scar running from the corner of his left eyebrow into the hairline, pale against sun-browned skin, the sort of mark you didn't ask about if you knew how to read people. Graham worked nights for a highway maintenance contractor because nights paid more and asked fewer questions. In Durango, the daytime crews dealt with traffic and complaints. The night crews dealt with silence, broken tar lines, and the kind of mistakes you only saw when the sunlight wasn't there to hide them. He liked that. Silence was honest. He could measure it, predict it, keep it contained, until it wasn't. A little behind him, just outside the halo of the work lights, Vanta watched the road with the stillness of a trained animal who had learned that the world changes first at the edges. The dog was a German shepherd, 6 years old, large without being bulky, built like a runner rather than a bruiser, deep chest, tight waist, powerful hindquarters. His coat was mostly black with smoke gray along the shoulders and hips, like ash brushed over velvet. The heat didn't make him restless, it made him quieter, mouth open just enough to cool, amber eyes tracking movement that Graham would never notice until it was too close. A black K9 harness sat snug against his shoulders, scuffed at the buckles, the patches faded from sun and use. One ear stood perfectly upright, the other tipped at the very end. A small imperfection that made him look less like a symbol and more like a living thing. Graham had been told once that dogs like Vanta were too smart for their own good. He didn't disagree. They had been together 3 years. Graham never called himself a handler. He didn't like titles he hadn't earned the clean way, but he moved with Vanta the way some people moved with their own shadow. The dog matched his pace, his stops, his attention, and when Graham's mind drifted into the darker lanes it sometimes did, Vanta nudged him back with a head against the thigh, a quiet insistence. Here, now, breathe. The foreman for the night shift was a man named Boyd Sutter, late 40s, broad in the middle, sunspots on his hands and neck from too many summers outside. Boyd had a mustache that used to be black and had gone tobacco gray, and he joked loud because he didn't like quiet. He walked the line of cones with a clipboard, pretending the paper mattered more than the crew, and stopped near Graham long enough to glance at the shepherd. "Your dog's the only one out here not sweating," Boyd said, and tried to make it sound like a compliment. Graham gave a small nod and returned to the edge of the shoulder, tamping a patch of gravel with the shovel's flat. He didn't joke back. He rarely did. Some men talked because they were afraid their thoughts would catch them if they stopped. Graham had lived with his thoughts long enough to know which ones were safe to leave loose. The shift ended after midnight. The road cooled in the way stone cools, slowly, grudgingly, releasing a smell like hot rubber and dust. Graham loaded tools into the bed of his old work truck, a white Ford with chipped paint and a dented rear quarter panel, and reached into the cooler for a bottle of water that was still warm. Vanta jumped up into the cab and turned once before settling, always facing forward, always ready. Graham drove without the radio. In town, he passed a row of dark storefronts and a motel sign buzzing insect blue against the night. Somewhere a train horn sounded, long and low, drifting across the river. Durango looked peaceful at night if you didn't know what lay in the gullies above it, waiting for rain. He parked behind the small rental house he'd been in since spring, a narrow place with peeling trim and a yard full of hard dirt. The porch light flickered when he stepped out, and the moths made frantic orbits around it. Graham's phone showed 2 missed calls from an unknown number, both earlier that evening, and a voicemail that lasted only 3 seconds, static, then silence. He listened twice, thumb tight on the screen, then tucked the phone away as if it had burned him. A manila envelope sat on the doormat like it belonged there. Thick paper, no stamp, no grease mark from the postal bins, just his name, Graham Kincaid, printed in clean block letters that looked too careful for a neighbor and too personal for a business. His shoulders tightened. He crouched, touched it with 2 fingers, then straightened and looked up and down the street. Nothing moved except a cottonwood branch shifting in the breeze. Vanta stepped onto the porch behind him, nails clicking softly on the boards. The dog lowered his head and sniffed the envelope once, then raised his gaze toward the dark end of the street, ears sharp. Not alarmed, focused. Graham's pulse rose anyway. He had learned in places far from Colorado that nothing was often just something waiting to show itself. Inside, the house smelled like detergent and old air conditioning. Graham turned on a single lamp, its light yellow and tired, and set the envelope on the kitchen table. He didn't open it right away. He washed his hands first, slowly, as if the water could rinse away the feeling of being watched. Vanta lay down near the doorway between the kitchen and living room, head on paws, eyes open, guarding without making a show of it. The envelope contained a formal letter on county letterhead and a smaller piece of folded paper sealed with a wax dot that had cracked in transit. The letter was short, written in the kind of language that tries to sound gentle while delivering a blunt fact. A relative had passed. A property was being transferred. The name of the attorney was printed at the bottom, along with an address in town and an office number. The relative was Lillian Hartwell. Graham read the name once, then again. It wasn't a name that lived in his daily thoughts, but it wasn't foreign either. It carried the faintest smell of cedar closets and menthol salve, the memory of a woman with practical hands who had once pressed a cool palm to his forehead when he was a kid and told him to stand up straight, even when you're tired. He hadn't seen her in over 20 years. Back then she had been Aunt Lillian, though she wasn't really his aunt, not by blood the way families like to pretend mattered. She had been his mother's cousin or his father's something, and she had lived up in the hills outside Durango where the roads turned to gravel and cell service died. Adults had called her odd. Children had called her quiet. Graham remembered her as the kind of person who watched before speaking, who smiled without showing teeth. The letter said she had named him as the sole beneficiary of her property near a place called Juniper Crown, and that per her instructions, the home was to remain unopened until he arrived. Graham turned the page as if there might be an explanation on the back. There wasn't. There was only a parcel number and a set of coordinates. He unfolded the smaller paper with the cracked wax seal. Inside was a single sentence in a handwriting he recognized, sharp and angled like it had been carved rather than written. If you're reading this, it means the mountain finally picked you. Graham sat very still. The air conditioner clicked on and off. Somewhere outside, a car passed, tires whispering on the street. Vanta lifted his head and looked at him, amber eyes steady. Graham didn't believe in mountains picking anyone. He believed in choices and consequences, in physics, in maps, in the simple math of cause and effect. And yet, in that moment, the sentence made the skin on his arms tighten as if the room had cooled. He reached for his notebook, the one he used for work, usually full of measurements and shift times, and wrote the coordinates down, then the name Juniper Crown, then paused. His pen hovered. Finally he wrote, in smaller letters beneath it, "Why me?" Vanta stood and padded over, pressing his shoulder against Graham's knee with quiet pressure. Graham exhaled, the kind of breath that left his chest reluctantly, as though it had been held there for months. He rested a hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. "You think we go?" he asked, voice low, almost embarrassed to be speaking aloud to a dog like that. Vanta didn't bark. He simply stared toward the front door, then back at Graham, then toward the door again, as if the path ahead was obvious, and the only question was whether Graham would stop arguing with himself long enough to walk it. Graham looked down at the letter on the table, at Lillian's handwriting on the folded note. Outside, the heat still clung to the night like a blanket nobody asked for. In the far distance, the mountains were invisible, but he could feel them anyway, present in the way the air smelled, present in the way Vanta's posture had changed, present in the sudden, unwelcome sense that his quiet life had been a temporary agreement, and someone had just torn up the contract. He closed the notebook, slid the documents back into the envelope, and set it beside his keys. "All right," he said finally, not to the dog so much as to the part of himself that always wanted to stay put. "We'll at least hear what the lawyer has to say." Vanta's tail thumped once against the floor, soft, controlled, like a signal rather than excitement. Graham turned off the lamp and stood in the darkness for a moment before heading to bed. And as he did, he noticed something else. He wasn't dreading sleep the way he usually did, not because he felt safe. Because for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might be moving toward something instead of running from it. Morning in Durango arrived without apology. By 7, the sun was already high enough to bleach the shadows from narrow gauge avenue, turning brick storefronts and parked pickups into flat plains of light. The air was dry and thin, carrying the metallic smell of rail tracks warming in the heat. Graham Kincaid drove with the windows down, one hand resting loosely on the wheel, the other on his thigh, feeling the vibration of the road travel up through the bones of his arm. Vanta sat in the passenger seat, upright and steady, head angled just enough to watch reflections slide across the glass. The dog had not slept much. Graham could tell by the way his ears flicked at sounds that didn't matter and ignored the ones that did. The law office sat between a closed travel agency and a bait and tackle shop that hadn't updated its sign since the 90s. A modest brick building, one story, its paint faded into the color of dried clay. The plaque by the door read, "Maeve Hollister, Attorney at Law." The letters were shallowly engraved, the edges worn smooth by decades of sun and wind, as if time itself had been rubbing its thumb over her name. Inside, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and something herbal, sage maybe. The waiting area was small, 2 wooden chairs with cracked vinyl cushions, a low table stacked with outdated magazines, and a framed photograph of the Durango and Silverton narrow-gauge railroad, taken back when the locomotives still ran coal. Graham paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. Vanta stopped at his knee, sat without being told, posture impeccable. A receptionist desk stood empty. No ringing phone, no hum of printers. The silence felt intentional, curated. Maeve Hollister appeared from a back office without hurry. She was taller than Graham expected, straight-backed despite her age, with iron-gray hair swept into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was narrow, angular, the kind that had been sharp in youth and had chosen not to soften with time. Fine lines traced outward from her eyes, not from smiling too much, but from squinting into difficult light. She wore a linen jacket the color of sand over a dark green blouse, and when she walked, she did so with the careful confidence of someone who had once moved too fast and learned the cost of it. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, voice low and steady, neither warm nor cold. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Her gaze flicked briefly to Vanta, then back to Graham. "You may bring your dog, I don't mind." Graham inclined his head, the closest he came to thanks, and followed her into the inner office. The room was narrow but deep, one long window, looking out onto the alley where dust motes danced in a slanted beam of light. Shelves lined the walls, filled not just with law books but with rolled maps, labeled binders, and a few small stones arranged on the sill as if they mattered. Maeve gestured to a chair across from her desk and sat opposite him, folding her hands with deliberate care. "I'll be direct," she said. Lillian Hartwell was precise about what she wanted done, and when. She did not believe in wasting words, and I won't insult her memory by doing so now. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of the documents Graham had already read, along with a photograph he hadn't seen before. It showed a wooden house pressed against a cliff, its roofline angled to follow the rock, as if the mountain had leaned down to listen. The image was sun-faded at the edges, one corner scorched as though it had been too close to a flame. That was taken 27 years ago, Maeve said. The property sits on the eastern face of Juniper Crown, outside standard development zones. No utilities beyond what Lillian installed herself. No cell coverage to speak of. The road is passable in summer, barely. "Why me?" Graham asked again. The words came out flat, stripped of accusation, but Maeve heard the tension beneath them. Maeve studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp with assessment rather than judgment. "Because you came back," she said. "Most people don't. They leave pieces of themselves elsewhere and build a life around the absence. You returned with your pieces intact, even if they were damaged." Graham's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. Maeve leaned back slightly. Lillian believed places remember people. She believed mountains remember more. She spent the last decade of her life documenting anomalies, pressure changes, subterranean water movement, low-frequency vibrations. She tried to interest the county. She tried the state. Eventually, she stopped trying. Maeve's mouth tightened just a fraction. Not because she was wrong, because she was tired. Vanta shifted, nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. His head lifted toward the window, ears pricked. Graham followed his gaze. Outside, somewhere down the alley, metal clanged, a dumpster lid maybe. Vanta relaxed again but did not lie down. "There's one more thing," Maeve said, opening a smaller envelope from the folder. "This was to be given to you in person." Inside lay a small brass object, heavy for its size. A key, its teeth worn but clean. Graham picked it up. It was warm, as if it had been waiting in a pocket. "That opens the cellar access beneath the main room," Maeve said. "Lillian specified that you were not to enter it alone. She did not say who you should bring, only that you would know." Graham glanced down at Vanta. The dog met his eyes calmly, as if this were a matter already settled. Maeve stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "I'll have a county surveyor meet you at the lower trailhead tomorrow at first light," she said. "A man named Elias Mercer, retired Forest Service, knows the ridge better than most. Trust him as far as he earns it." Outside, the heat struck again, sudden and oppressive. Graham stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the folder tucked under his arm, the key heavy in his palm. Across the street, a woman was tying a horse to a hitching post outside the tack shop. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, sun-browned skin pulled tight over muscle earned the hard way. Her hair, the color of dark wheat, was braided down her back, and the horse, a chestnut mare with a white blaze, stood patient and alert beside her. The woman glanced over, curiosity brief and unforced, then returned to adjusting the saddle. Graham felt a strange sense of being observed, not by her, but by the mountain he could not yet see. On the drive home, he took the long way, skirting the edge of town where the pavement gave way to dirt and scrub. Vanta's head rested near the open window, nose working, reading a language Graham could not. The key lay on the seat between them, catching light with every turn. That afternoon, Graham packed with the efficiency of someone who had learned to leave fast. Water, food, rope, first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, his old field notebook. He did not pack weapons. He did pack patience. When he finished, he sat on the edge of the bed, the heat pressing in, and listened to the distant sound of thunder far off in the mountains. Dry storms, all noise and no rain. Vanta lay at his feet, eyes half closed but ready. As the sun slid west and the shadows lengthened, Graham stepped outside and locked the door of the small rental house. He did not know how long he would be gone. He only knew that the quiet he had built for himself was about to be tested by a different kind of silence, the kind that waited under stone, listening for footsteps. Dawn found Durango already warm, the sun climbing fast and sharp over the eastern ridge, turning the Animas River into a ribbon of broken light. Graham Kincaid left town before most storefronts unlocked their doors. The truck bed held his packed gear secured with canvas straps, and the brass key Maeve had given him rested in the center console, wrapped in a folded bandana, as if that might dull its weight. Vanta sat upright in the passenger seat, window cracked just enough to let in the sense of sage dust and warming pine. His posture was calm but alert, the way it always was when Graham moved toward something unknown rather than away from it. The paved road narrowed into gravel 20 minutes out, climbing steadily until cell service vanished without ceremony. Juniper Crown rose ahead, its slopes thick with scrub oak and ponderosa pine, the rock faces pale and exposed where old slides had torn away soil. Summer storms hadn't come yet, but the ground bore their memory in dry channels and bleached stones. Graham slowed as a Forest Service truck came into view at the trailhead, parked crookedly beside a weathered sign warning of fire restrictions in unstable terrain. A man leaned against the hood of the truck, hat pulled low, arms crossed as if he had learned long ago not to trust empty space. Elias Mercer looked to be in his late 50s, tall and rope-thin, with shoulders that sloped slightly forward from years of carrying packs and expectations. His beard was a mix of gray and brown, trimmed close along the jaw but fuller at the chin, giving his face a blunt, squared-off look. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes down toward his cheeks, carved there by sun and squinting rather than age alone. He wore a faded Forest Service shirt tucked into canvas pants, boots scuffed but meticulously maintained. When he straightened, there was a stiffness to his right leg, subtle but present, the kind that spoke of an injury that never healed right, and a man who refused to let it define him. "You're Kincaid," Elias said as Graham stepped out. His voice was low, dry, without wasted inflection. It wasn't a question. Graham nodded. "And you're Mercer." "Elias," the man corrected. He glanced briefly at Vanta, assessing without reaching. "Good dog." Vanta met his gaze, tail still, ears forward, not friendly, not hostile, evaluating. Elias pushed off the truck and reached into the cab, pulling out a rolled map secured with a rubber band. "Maeve called late yesterday," he said. "Didn't give details, just said you were coming and that Lillian wanted it this way." His mouth tightened slightly at the name. "I knew her, not well. Enough." They spread the map across the hood. Elias pointed with a thick finger, nail cracked and stained from years of dirt. "We're here. Old Service Road takes us about 3 miles up. After that, it's foot travel. The house sits here, east face, tucked against the rock. You won't see it until you're almost on top of it." "Anyone else been up there recently?" Graham asked. Elias hesitated, just a beat too long to be nothing. "Depends what you mean by anyone. Officially? No. Unofficially? I've seen tire tracks that don't belong to hikers, fresh enough to bother me." He looked Graham over again, more carefully this time. "You expecting trouble?" "I'm expecting answers," Graham said. "Trouble tends to come along anyway." Elias's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Fair enough." They set off up the road, Elias driving ahead in the Forest Service truck, Graham following. The climb was steady and unforgiving, gravel popping under tires, dust rising in pale clouds that hung in the still air. When the road finally narrowed into a trail too tight for vehicles, they parked beneath a stand of pines. The silence here was different from town silence. It wasn't empty. It waited. They shouldered packs and moved on foot. Elias walked with a long, efficient stride, favoring his right leg just enough to notice if you knew how to look. He used a walking stick carved smooth by use, tapping the ground ahead of him more out of habit than need. Graham followed a few paces back, letting Vanta range slightly ahead. The dog moved with controlled energy, nose low, then lifting occasionally to test the air. His black and gray coat blended with shadow and stone, making him nearly invisible when he paused. The trail wound upward through scrub and rock, the sun filtering down in harsh slices. Sweat darkened the back of Graham's shirt, but he welcomed the physical exertion. It anchored him in the present. Elias spoke little, but when he did, it mattered. He pointed out old burn scars from a fire 15 years back, explained how the land healed itself unevenly, how water found paths people never anticipated. "Lillian used to say the mountain had habits," Elias said at one point, stopping to rest against a boulder. "Said if you paid attention long enough, you could predict what it would do next. Most folks laughed. I didn't. I'd seen stranger things." He rubbed his knee absently, eyes distant. "Lost a friend up here once. Rockslide after a dry storm. No warning. Just gone. Makes you respectful. They reached a narrow overlook by late morning. From there, the valley opened below them, Durango a scatter of rooftops and roads in the distance. Heat shimmered off the rock and cicadas buzzed relentlessly. Vanta stopped dead, body taut, head angled toward the east face. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He listened. Elias noticed. He does that often. Only when something changes, Graham said. They continued, dropping down a faint side path that hugged the cliff. The air cooled slightly as the rock face cast deeper shade. Then the house emerged, sudden and quiet. Pressed into the stone as if grown there. Up close, it looked both sturdier and more fragile than the photograph had suggested. Thick timber beams anchored into the rock, weathered silver by sun and time. Windows small and narrow, designed to keep heat out rather than invite light. The roofline followed the cliff's angle with deliberate precision. Elias stopped at the edge of the clearing. "That's as far as I go," he said. "Lillian asked me not to cross the threshold, said some things need to be met, not witnessed." Graham studied the house, then turned back. "You sure?" Elias met his eyes. "I'm sure enough." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small radio. "I'll be on this channel. If you need me, call. If you don't, I'll check back before dark." He paused, then added, "She chose you for a reason, Kincaid. I don't know what it is, but I know she didn't choose lightly." Graham nodded once. Elias turned and made his careful way back up the trail, his figure soon swallowed by brush and shadow. Alone now, Graham approached the house with measured steps. The heat here felt different, muted by the stone. Vanta moved ahead, sniffing the ground near the foundation, then the door. The wood was cool beneath Graham's hand when he touched it, the grain raised and rough. He unlocked it with a key from the ring Maeve had provided. The door opened with a low creak that echoed briefly, then settled into stillness. Inside, the air smelled of dry pine, dust, and something mineral, like stone after rain. Light filtered through narrow windows, striping the floor. The space was simple but intentional, a heavy table, shelves built into the wall. A hearth set deep into the rock, no clutter, no decay. The place had been waiting. Vanta crossed the threshold and stopped, ears forward, eyes scanning. His tail remained low but relaxed. Graham closed the door behind them and stood quietly, letting the house speak in its own way. He did not descend into the cellar. Not yet. That could wait. For now it was enough to be here, to feel the weight of the mountain above and the strange certainty settling into his bones. Outside, somewhere far below, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest hum, a sound too low to be called noise, too steady to be ignored. Graham felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of his boots. Vanta lifted his head, eyes bright, and for the first time since they'd started this climb, the dog let out a soft, questioning whine. Graham rested a hand on Vanta's neck. "I hear it too," he said quietly. And with that acknowledgement, the house seemed to settle around them, as if accepting their presence and bracing for what would come next. By midday, the heat pressed hard against the stone, but inside the house it stayed cool in a way that felt deliberate, engineered by patience rather than technology. Graham Kincaid set his pack down near the hearth and took a slow circuit of the main room, letting his eyes move before his hands did. The walls were thick, the beams dark with age, and every surface carried the faint marks of careful use instead of neglect. This was not a place abandoned. It was a place left behind, on purpose. Vanta followed at a measured distance, nails clicking softly, nose testing corners where dust gathered thinly. He was 6 years old, but moved with the restraint of an older dog, seasoned by work that had taught him when not to rush. His ears pivoted constantly, catching sounds Graham could not, tiny shifts in air, the creak of wood responding to heat. When Graham stopped, Vanta stopped. When Graham knelt to inspect the hearth, Vanta sat, head tilted, eyes intent but calm. On a shelf built directly into the stone wall sat a row of notebooks, their spines cracked, pages yellowed. Graham lifted one carefully. The handwriting inside was angular and spare, the same hand that had written the sentence Maeve had given him. Measurements filled most pages, numbers, arrows, dates. But here and there were sentences that broke through the data like breaths taken between long dives. Sound increases after sunset. Pressure stable, despite drought, the mountain responds. He set the notebook down and crossed to the far corner of the room, where a woven rug lay slightly askew. Beneath it, the wood floor was darker, the boards newer. Graham crouched and pressed his palm flat, cool, solid. Vanta stepped closer, sniffed once, then sat so close his shoulder brushed Graham's arm. The dog did not scratch or whine. He waited. The brass key lay heavy in Graham's pocket. He did not take it out immediately. Instead, he stood and moved to the narrow window that faced east, peering out at the rock wall rising just beyond the house. Sunlight slid down the stone in sharp bands, illuminating veins and fractures like scars. He remembered Elias's words, "Some things need to be met, not witnessed." The thought sat with him, not as a warning, but as a boundary. A knock at the door broke the stillness. 3 firm taps, unhurried. Vanta was on his feet in an instant, body angled toward the sound, ears forward. Graham rested a hand lightly on the dog's harness and moved to the door, opening it just wide enough to see. A woman stood on the threshold, her hat pushed back, hair damp with sweat. She was in her late 30s or early 40s, tall and long-limbed, with sun-browned skin and shoulders shaped by years of riding and lifting, rather than any deliberate training. Her hair was a dark blonde, streaked lighter by summer, pulled into a loose braid that brushed the collar of her faded denim shirt. Dust clung to her boots and the cuffs of her jeans. She looked directly at Graham, eyes a clear gray-green that took in details quickly without lingering on any one thing. "Name's Sarah Pike," she said. Her voice was low, steady, the accent local, but softened by time spent elsewhere. "Elias sent me up. Said you'd be here today." Behind her, a chestnut gelding stood tied loosely to a juniper, head lowered, reins slack. The horse was older, maybe 12 or 13, muscle still firm but no longer tight, a white sock marking one foreleg. He flicked an ear toward Vanta, then back to the insects buzzing around his flank, unconcerned. "I ride supplies up this way when needed," Sarah continued, "and messages when radios don't cut it." She glanced briefly at Vanta, assessing, then nodded once. Good-looking shepherd. Calm. "He's working," Graham said. "So am I," Sarah replied without offense. She held out a folded piece of paper. "Elias wanted you to have this before he headed down." Graham took it. Inside was a rough sketch of the area around the house with a note scrawled at the bottom, "Check the cellar before nightfall. Storms build fast this time of year." "Anything else?" Graham asked. Sarah hesitated just a fraction. "There have been riders up on the South Spur lately, not locals. Trucks too far in for comfort." She shrugged, but her eyes sharpened. "Could be nothing. Could be people who don't like being seen." "Did they see you?" Graham asked. Sarah smiled thinly. "Everyone sees a horse before they see the rider. Comes with the territory." She tipped her hat. "I'll be back up this way in a couple days. If you need anything, leave a marker on the trail. I'll notice." She untied the gelding, mounted in a smooth, economical motion, and rode off, the horse's hooves muffled by dust and pine needles. Graham watched until they disappeared around a bend, then closed the door and slid the bolt home. Inside, the quiet returned, deeper now, threaded with something else, anticipation maybe. Graham went back to the rug and lifted it fully. The outline of the cellar door was clear now, its edges flush with the surrounding floor. He knelt and fitted the brass key into the lock. It turned with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. Vanta stood directly behind him, close enough that Graham could feel the dog's breath against his shoulder. He placed a hand on Vanta's chest, grounding himself as much as the dog. Then he lifted the door. Cool air rose from below, dry and mineral, carrying a faint vibration that Graham felt through his knees before he heard it. The stairs descended steeply, cut directly into stone, their edges worn smooth. He descended slowly, counting steps without meaning to, the lantern beam steady in his hand. The cellar opened into a narrow chamber no wider than a hallway. Its walls lined with shelves and equipment older than Graham, but well cared for. Coils of wire hung neatly from pegs. A small desk was bolted into the rock, its surface covered with notebooks and a compact recording device, the kind used for fieldwork decades ago. On the far wall, a seam in the stone pulsed faintly, not with light, but with rhythm. a low, steady hum that seemed to rise and fall like breath. Vanta patted down the last step and sat, posture alert but not fearful. His ears were forward, eyes fixed on the seam. He did not bark. Graham set the lantern down and placed his palm flat against the stone. The vibration was unmistakable now, gentle but persistent. Alive was the wrong word. Active was closer, responsive. He picked up the nearest notebook and flipped to the last page. The date was recent, less than a year old. The handwriting was firm, though the ink had bled slightly as if the pen had lingered too long in one place. "If you're here," it read, "then I was right to wait. The sound is changing. Someone else has noticed. Protect the rhythm. It sustains more than water." Graham closed the book slowly. Above them, the house creaked as heat shifted the beams. Outside, thunder rolled faintly, far off but moving closer. He did not explore further. Not yet. This was enough for one day. He extinguished the lantern, closed the cellar door, and replaced the rug. When he stood, the room felt different, no longer simply quiet but aware. Vanta looked up at him, tail giving a single measured thump against the floor. "We'll do this right," Graham said, more promise than plan. Outside, the first breath of a summer storm moved across the ridge, carrying with it the scent of rain and something older, stirred but not yet disturbed. The storm arrived without ceremony. One moment the air was merely heavy, pressing down through the pines like an unseen hand, and the next the sky cracked open with a sound that rolled across the ridge and settled into Graham Kincaid's chest. Thunder in the mountains never asked permission. It announced itself as fact. Graham stood just inside the doorway, listening as rain began to strike the roof in sharp, scattered beats that quickly thickened into a steady drumming. The house took it well. The beams did not groan, and the walls did not shudder. It had been built to endure weather that tested weaker structures into surrender. Vanta paced once along the narrow length of the room, then stopped near the hearth, body angled toward the floor as if the sound of rain had tuned him to something beneath it. His ears flicked, not at the thunder, but at the low vibration that threaded through the stone like a second pulse, steady and patient. Graham felt it too now, subtle, persistent, less like noise and more like pressure, equalizing inside a sealed space. He set a pot on the small propane burner Lillian had left behind and waited for water to heat, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Years ago he had learned the cost of rushing into enclosed spaces without understanding their behavior. Storms had a way of pushing people into mistakes. He would not give this place that opportunity. Rain slashed sideways against the east-facing windows, carrying grit and pine needles. Through the glass, the cliff face darkened as water traced paths it had memorized long before Graham was born. He watched the lines form, split, rejoin. The mountain did not fight the storm. It accepted it, guided it. A sound cut through the rain, metal on metal, distant but distinct. Graham stilled. Vanta froze mid-step, head lifting, muscles tightening beneath his coat. The sound came again, rhythmic this time, out of place against the organic chaos of weather. "Not thunder," Graham murmured. He moved to the narrow window on the south side and peered out. Visibility was poor, but between curtains of rain, he caught a brief flash of reflected light far down the slope, too precise to be lightning, headlamps, or work lights. Sarah's warning returned to him, uninvited. Riders on the south spur, trucks too far in. Graham set his mug down untouched and reached for his pack, slipping into his rain shell with practiced efficiency. He checked the radio Elias had given him. Static. Then Elias's voice broke through, strained but clear enough. "Kincaid," Elias said, "you seeing this storm?" "I see it," Graham replied. "I hear something else too." A pause. Rain hissed in the background on Elias's end. "South spur. You're not imagining it." "Are they close?" "Closer than I like, and moving uphill." Graham looked at Vanta. The dog met his eyes, tail low, ready. "I'm not engaging," Graham said. "I'm observing." "Good," Elias replied. "Storm's going to do some of the talking for us." The radio cut to static again. Graham clipped it to his belt and stepped onto the porch. Rain soaked him instantly, cold against skin overheated from the climb. The air smelled sharp now, mineral and green. He crouched, letting the porch railing shield him as he scanned the slope. The lights below moved irregularly, stopping, then starting again, their beams cutting sideways through rain. Whoever was down there was fighting terrain and weather both. A sudden crack echoed, wood splitting, followed by a deep, hollow thud. The ground trembled faintly beneath Graham's boots. Vanta let out a low growl, not aggressive, but alerting. "Easy," Graham said, more to himself than the dog. The tremor passed, but the vibration beneath the floor intensified, the steady hum gaining urgency, like a breath drawn too quickly. Graham backed inside and closed the door, sliding the bolt home. He knelt and pressed his palm to the floorboards where the cellar door lay hidden beneath the rug. The vibration was stronger now, responding perhaps to the disruption below. He made a decision he had been postponing. Graham lifted the rug and opened the cellar door again, descending with the lantern held low. The chamber below felt tighter than before, the air drier despite the storm. The seam in the stone pulsed faintly, not brighter, but faster. He crouched and listened, counting the rhythm as he once counted his own breath to stay calm under pressure. Vanta sat at the top of the stairs, ears forward, watching him, trusting but vigilant. The recording device on the desk flickered to life when Graham brushed against it. A low, crackling sound emerged, resolving slowly into a voice, Lillian's, older than Graham remembered, but steady. "If you're hearing this during a storm," the recording said, "then someone is interfering. The mountain compensates, but only to a point. Do not block the flow. Do not force it open. Let it speak." Another tremor rippled through the stone, stronger this time. Above, thunder cracked so close the walls seemed to jump. Graham climbed back to the main room just as a sharp cry cut through the storm outside. A human voice, thin with panic. Vanta was already at the door. Graham swung it open. Rain drove in hard, soaking the floor, but the sound was unmistakable now, shouting. He scanned the slope and spotted a figure stumbling along the narrow path below, silhouetted briefly by lightning. The person slipped, caught themselves, then went down again, disappearing behind a stand of scrub. "Stay close," Graham told Vanta, grabbing rope and a flashlight. He did not think beyond that. Some instincts did not require debate. They moved fast, boots sliding on wet stone, rain blinding. The path had turned into a channel, water rushing where solid ground should have been. Graham dropped to one knee and anchored the rope around a thick pine, then edged forward. Vanta followed without command, low to the ground, moving like a shadow. They found the man wedged against a boulder, one leg pinned awkwardly beneath him. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, dark hair plastered to his forehead, beard thick and uneven as if he hadn't planned on being seen today. His jacket bore a company logo half scraped away by rock and rain. His eyes were wide, unfocused. "Don't move!" Graham shouted over the storm. "I've got you!" The man coughed, nodding weakly. "They said it was stable," he gasped. "Just a test site." Graham did not respond. He worked the rope under the man's arms, braced his feet, and signaled Vanta. The dog dug in, muscles coiling, adding his weight at just the right moment. Together, they shifted the man free as another section of rock slid loose behind them, crashing down into the ravine below. They hauled him up the path inch by inch until solid ground returned beneath their feet. The man collapsed, shivering violently despite the heat. Graham checked him quickly. No obvious fractures, shock setting in. He wrapped him in his own jacket and dragged him under the partial shelter of an overhang. "Where are the others?" Graham asked. The man swallowed hard. "Pulled out when the rain started, left me to secure the pump." His gaze flicked toward the mountain, terror cutting through exhaustion. "Something down there's pushing back." Another deep rumble rolled through the ground, longer this time, resonant. The lights below flickered, then went dark. Graham felt it through his boots, up his legs, into his spine. Not anger. Correction. He keyed the radio. "Elias, I've got one of them, alive. The site's failing." Elias's reply came fast. "Copy. County's been notified. You need to get back to the house, now." Graham didn't argue. With Vanta's help, he got the man moving uphill, step by step, the storm easing just enough to let them breathe. By the time they reached the porch, rain had softened into a steady fall, thunder retreating deeper into the valley. Inside, Graham settled the man near the hearth, checked his vitals again, and offered water. The man's breathing steadied. He stared at the floor. At nothing. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," he whispered. "They said it was just water." Graham looked down through the floorboards, feeling the vibration slow, settle. "It never is," he said quietly. Outside, the storm moved on, leaving the mountain rinsed and breathing easier, as if it had spoken and been heard, at least for now. The rain thinned to a gray veil by late afternoon, leaving the ridge rinsed and steaming. Graham Kincaid stood on the porch with a towel draped over his shoulders, watching water slide off the roof in steady threads. The man he'd pulled from the slope, now sitting upright near the hearth, had stopped shaking. Color crept back into his face, a dull red beneath stubble that hadn't known a razor in weeks. He was stocky, built for lifting rather than climbing, with a heavy brow and a mouth that set hard even when he tried to soften it. Shock had given way to shame. "I'm Mark Deller," the man said finally, eyes fixed on the floor. His voice was rough, scraped raw by panic and rain. "Field tech, pumps and monitoring." He glanced toward the cellar door without lifting his head. "I wasn't supposed to be alone." "No one is when things go wrong," Graham said. He handed Mark a mug of warm water, not coffee. Stimulants could wait. "Who sent you?" Mark swallowed. "Contract came through a shell. Logistics routed through a firm out of Farmington. We were told it was a groundwater assessment, temporary draw, portable rigs, nothing invasive." He laughed once, short and bitter. "That was a lie." Vanta lay between them, broad chest rising and falling, eyes open. The dog watched Mark the way he watched storms, without judgment, but without trust. A truck engine sounded below, climbing, then cut. Moments later, boots on wet stone approached the porch. Elias Mercer stepped into view, hat brimmed dark with rain, beard slicked close to his jaw. He carried himself like a man who'd already decided what needed doing and was only checking if the world agreed. "County's mobilizing," Elias said, glancing at Mark. "Sheriff's office, environmental, storm forced their hand." He met Graham's eyes. "You did the right thing." "Right isn't finished," Graham replied. He nodded toward the cellar. "They're tapping something they don't understand." Elias's mouth tightened. "That tracks." Another vehicle arrived, this one lighter, with a rack of equipment strapped to the roof. A woman climbed out, efficient and unhurried despite the mud. She was in her early 30s, lean with short dark hair tucked behind her ears and a posture that spoke of long days carrying instruments across uneven ground. Her skin was pale where rain hadn't touched it yet, freckles scattered across her nose. She wore a weatherproof jacket with a state emblem, half obscured by grime. "Rowan Sloan," she said, extending a hand to Graham. Her grip was firm, practiced. "Hydrology and subsurface flow. Elias called me from the switchback." She glanced inside, eyes sharpening when she felt the vibration through her boots. "That's not runoff." Graham led her to the cellar entrance. He did not open it immediately. "Before we go down," he said, "understand this. The flow responds. Not like a machine. More like a system that's been alive long enough to learn." Rowan's expression didn't change, but her eyes brightened with interest rather than skepticism. "Living systems can be hydraulic," she said. "We just don't like to admit it when they don't fit the model." They descended together. The chamber hummed, quieter now than during the storm, but present. Rowan knelt, set a compact sensor against the stone, and watched the readout settle into a repeating pattern. "Pressure's oscillating," she murmured. "Regular. Too regular for fractured aquifer flow. Someone's been drawing intermittently, on purpose." She traced the seam with a gloved finger, careful not to block it. "You block this," she added, "and the mountain finds another way, usually sideways." Above them, Mark's voice drifted down, tight with fear. "We didn't drill here first. There's a service tunnel off the south spur. Old, repurposed. They moved pumps through at night." Elias swore softly. "I'll get eyes on it." Before he could turn, another set of boots sounded, lighter, quicker. Sarah Pike stepped into the doorway, rain jacket unzipped, braid loosened by the weather. Her horse stood tethered below, patient, steam lifting from its hide. Sarah's gaze took in Mark, the gear, the open cellar, and settled on Graham. "They're pulling out," she said. "Two trucks headed downslope. No lights, trying to vanish." Rowan straightened. "If they cut and run without sealing, you'll get a pressure snapback. That could trigger slides." Graham didn't hesitate. Elias, coordinate with the county. Sarah, can you ride the spur and mark the tunnel entrance? Sarah nodded. I already have. Vanta rose, muscles bunching, ready. Graham clipped the leash not to restrain but to anchor. You're with me, he told the dog, and meant it in every sense. They moved fast but not careless. The path down was slick, the air heavy with wet pine and stone. Mark insisted on coming, favoring his leg but steady enough. I know the layout, he said. I'll point. The tunnel mouth yawned from the hillside like a wound, reinforced with corrugated steel, water sluicing along its lip. Inside, pumps thrummed weakly, hoses snaking back into darkness. Graham cut the power at the junction box. The sound died, replaced by a deep settling sigh from the mountain itself. The ground shuddered once, then stilled. Rowan checked her sensor. Stabilizing, she said. Relief edged her voice. For now. Headlights flared below. Sheriff's trucks, county rigs. The response Elias had promised arrived with gravel crunch and clipped commands. A deputy approached, mid-40s, square-jawed, mustache neatly trimmed, eyes tired but focused. He took in the scene, nodded once to Graham. We'll handle custody. Mark slumped, the fight leaving him. I'll testify, he said hoarsely. I'm done lying. Back at the house, the evening cooled the stone. Rowan sat at the table, data spread before her, expression intent. This place, she said, looking up at Graham, is rare, not magic, not myth, just a system that learned balance before we learned greed. Graham looked down through the floorboards, felt the steady pulse, slower now, healthier. Vanta lay beside him, chin on paws, eyes bright. We protect it, Graham said. It wasn't a question. Rowan smiled, just a little. Then we start tonight. Outside, the ridge breathed, and for the first time since the storm, the sound felt like gratitude rather than warning. Morning broke clear and sharp after the storm, sunlight rinsing the ridge in pale gold. Juniper Crown looked almost gentle from the porch, the rock faces drying into familiar lines, the pines shaking off last night's burden. Graham Kincaid woke before the light fully reached the windows, the way he always did when responsibility pressed heavier than sleep. Vanta rose with him, stretching once, joints popping softly, then settled at the threshold to watch the day arrive. The house no longer felt like a shelter borrowed from the mountain. It felt like a post. Temporary, yes, but necessary. Graham brewed coffee on the propane burner and drank it standing, eyes on the slope where county vehicles now dotted the lower access road. The mountain's hum had slowed to a steady, unhurried rhythm. It was not silent. It was stable. By mid-morning, the porch filled with people who moved differently than hikers, clipboards, radios, hard hats strapped to packs. Sheriff's deputies took statements while a pair of environmental officers photographed the tunnel entrance from multiple angles. Rowan Sloan stood near the edge of the clearing, sleeves rolled, calibrating her instruments with a focus that shut the rest of the world out. Her short, dark hair was still damp at the nape from sweat. A smear of mud traced one cheekbone like a careless brushstroke. She looked up when Graham approached. They're sealing the auxiliary intake, she said, tapping her tablet. Temporary collars, non-invasive. It'll hold until a full assessment team gets here. Assessment takes time, Graham said. Rowan nodded. And pressure hates waiting. She paused, then met his eyes. That's why your notebooks matter. Lillian's, I mean. Patterns over years. They give us context. Inside, Mark Deller sat at the table with a deputy, signing his name where it would count. He looked smaller in daylight, the set of his shoulders slack with exhaustion rather than defiance. The deputy, a woman this time, early 40s, dark hair pulled into a severe bun, kept her voice even and patient. She wore her authority like a well-fitted coat, neither flaunted nor hidden. I'll testify, Mark said again, as if repetition could make it stick. They moved equipment through shell contracts, night runs, no permits. He rubbed his hands together. I didn't ask enough questions. The deputy's pen scratched. You're asking them now. Outside, Elias Mercer coordinated with a county engineer, his stance angled to spare his bad knee. The engineer, Caleb Knorr, mid-30s, square-faced with a permanent squint from years of sun glare, listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with careful precision. If the draw resumes even intermittently, you'll get lateral migration, he said. That's when slopes decide they've had enough. Sarah Pike arrived with a saddlebag of supplies and a face set hard by resolve. Her braid had been redone tighter, practical. The chestnut gelding stood calm at the hitch, ears flicking at voices. Sarah leaned against the rail beside Graham, eyes on the activity below. "They'll try again," she said quietly. "Not today. Maybe not here. But people who think in shortcuts don't unlearn that overnight." Graham watched the deputies load evidence bags. "We make it harder," he said, "and brighter." By afternoon, a temporary perimeter went up, flags, signs, a locked gate at the service road. The county engineer posted notices citing environmental review. It was necessary theater, and it bought time. Rowan gathered Graham, Elias, and Sarah inside the house, spreading maps across the table. The cellar door remained closed beneath the rug, its presence felt without being acknowledged. "We need a standing watch," Rowan said. "Sensors that log continuously, not just pressure, acoustics, temperature gradients. The system responds to interference before it fails. That's our warning." Elias nodded. "Forest Service can authorize a conservation designation pending review. It won't stop everyone, but it gives us teeth." "And eyes," Sarah added. "I can rotate patrols with a couple riders. We know the spurs better than trucks do." Graham listened, then spoke. "I'll stay." The room went quiet. Rowan tilted her head. "This isn't a job offer." "It is," Graham said. "For me." He met each of their gazes in turn. "I can keep the house, keep records, coordinate. I don't need a title." Elias studied him, lines deepening around his eyes. "You understand what that means?" "I do." That evening, as the teams packed up, a small helicopter thudded overhead, ferrying a survey crew toward the valley. The sound receded, leaving the ridge to itself. Graham walked the perimeter with Vanta, checking the new gate, the flags fluttering lightly in the breeze. The dog moved easily now, tension eased, but awareness intact. Near the service road, a man waited beside a dusty pickup. He stood when Graham approached, hands visible. He was in his late 40s, tall with a long, narrow face and a beard cut close to the jaw. His hair was threaded with gray at the temples, his eyes pale and intent. He wore clean boots that hadn't seen much mud. "Name's Trent Halloway," he said, offering a business card Graham did not take. "Consultant. My firm advises on resource development. We'd like to talk about access." Graham's voice stayed level. "There's no access." Trent smiled without warmth. "Everything has access. It's just a question of terms." Vanta stepped forward half a pace, posture firm. Trent's eyes flicked to the dog, then back. The smile thinned. "This land's under review," Graham said. "Any attempt to enter will be documented." Trent exhaled through his nose. "You're making this personal." Graham shook his head. "You already did." He turned away, ending it. Night came softly. The stars were sharp. The air cool. Graham sat on the porch with Rowan, the day's data humming quietly from her equipment. She looked tired but satisfied. "People think protection is loud," she said. "It's usually just consistent." Inside, Graham opened Lillian's last notebook again, reading the margins he'd skimmed before. "Keep the record. Let others verify." He added a date beneath her final entry and wrote, in his own hand, steady and unadorned, "Stabilized after interference, ceased. Watch continues." When he closed the book, the mountain's rhythm felt closer, like a conversation held at a respectful distance. Vanta settled at his feet, sighing, a sound of contentment rather than relief. They were not finished, but they were no longer alone. Summer settled fully over Juniper Crown, not as a blanket but as a rhythm. Days grew longer, the light gentler, the storms fewer and more predictable. The ridge learned the pattern of human footsteps again, measured, respectful, and the mountain answered by holding steady. Graham Kincaid woke each morning before the sun cleared the eastern rock, brewed coffee, and wrote. Dates, numbers, sounds, not because anyone told him to, but because keeping the record had become a way of listening. The house adjusted to him as much as he adjusted to it. He repaired a loose shutter, resealed a window seam, replaced a warped porch board with a piece cut to fit the grain. None of it changed the character of the place. It clarified it. Vanta took to the routine easily. At 6, the shepherd had the confidence of a dog who knew his work mattered and the patience of one who didn't need praise to do it. His coat lightened slightly in the sun, black giving way to charcoal along the shoulders, the gray at his muzzle more visible now. He patrolled without command, learned the edges of the perimeter, and slept deeply at night, head on paws, ears tuned to the low register of the ridge. The sensors Rowan installed began to tell a story anyone willing to read could understand. Pressure curves smoothed, acoustic spikes flattened, the mountain's hum became a baseline instead of a warning. Rowan returned every few days with new equipment and a quieter smile. She had a way of moving through the house that respected its angles, never leaning on a beam or setting a case on the hearthstone. Her questions were precise. Her silences were comfortable. "This is what stability looks like," she said one afternoon, tapping a graph on her tablet. "Not perfect, resilient." Elias Mercer made good on his word. The Forest Service designation came through pending review, a provisional conservation status that slowed opportunists and empowered stewards. Elias walked the boundary with Graham, cane tapping, eyes scanning. He spoke less than ever, but when he did, it was with the relief of a man who had waited too long to see something done right. Sarah Pike organized the patrols. She rode the spurs at dawn and dusk, her chestnut gelding sure-footed and patient, age lending him wisdom rather than wear. Sarah herself carried authority without noise. Tall, sun-browned, braid tight, eyes always moving. She kept notes on tire tracks, boot prints, changes in brush. When she smiled, it was brief and genuine. When she frowned, it meant someone had misjudged the land. The pressure from outside didn't vanish, it changed shape. Letters arrived, polite and persistent, offers with legal polish. Graham read them, filed them, and responded only when necessary. When Trent Holloway returned, he did so with an assistant this time. A younger man with a tablet and a suit that didn't fit the dust. Trent's beard was trimmed to a sharper line, his smile practiced. "You've created an asset," Trent said, gesturing broadly. "Protection doesn't have to mean isolation." "It does here," Graham replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Vanta stood at his side, still as stone. The offers stopped after the county posted its findings, the testimony held, the permits were denied, the shell companies dissolved. It wasn't justice in the cinematic sense, it was better. It was boring, durable accountability. On a quiet evening near the end of August, the Ridge hosted a small gathering. No banners, no cameras. Rowan brought 2 graduate students, one red-haired and freckled, the other dark-skinned and soft-spoken, who set up additional monitors under her watchful eye. Elias stood off to the side with a paper cup of coffee. Sarah arrived late, dust on her boots, horse grazing nearby. The sheriff sent a deputy with a box of pastries and a nod of thanks. They stood on the porch as the sun lowered, light scattering gold across the rock. Rowan spoke briefly, careful with her words. "This place is now officially registered as a monitoring station. It doesn't belong to an agency. It belongs to the record," Graham nodded. "Then we keep it." He took out his pocket knife, an old one, blade dulled by honest work, and knelt by the porch step. He didn't carve his name. He didn't carve a date. He carved 3 words, slow and clean, following the grain. Listen, guard, live. Vanta watched, head tilted, tail sweeping once across the boards. That night, after the others left, Graham sat alone with the notebook open on his knee. He wrote the day's numbers, then paused. The mountain's hum was steady, close enough to feel through the soles of his boots. He wrote one more line, not data, but intent. Stewardship accepted. Weeks passed. The season leaned toward fall without urgency. Graham fixed the gate again after a windstorm, replaced a sensor battery, answered Rowan's emails with clipped precision. He slept better than he had in years. When memories came, they did not ambush him. They lined up and waited their turn, like soldiers who had learned to stand down. One afternoon, a family hiking the lower trail stopped at the sign Sarah had posted. A child asked if the house was haunted. Graham smiled, shook his head. "It's listening," he said. The child considered this and nodded, satisfied. As September cooled the air, Graham received a final letter from Maeve Hollister. It was brief. Lillian would be glad, it read. She always said the right caretaker would arrive without announcement. Graham folded the letter and placed it with the others, then closed the drawer. At dusk, he walked the perimeter with Vanta. The dog moved easily, no longer scanning for threats that never came. They paused at the overlook where the valley opened wide. Lights blinked on below, small and human. Graham rested a hand on Vanta's neck, feeling the dog's steady warmth. "We're home," he said. The mountain answered, not with a roar, not with silence, but with a low, even breath that carried through stone and air alike. It held, and so did they. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly, through endurance, through compassion, through a single choice to stay when walking away would be easier. Maybe the miracle wasn't the mountain breathing again. Maybe it was a broken heart learning to listen, a loyal companion refusing to leave, and a forgotten place becoming a refuge once more. In our daily lives, we all face moments when no one is watching, moments where fear, loneliness, or exhaustion tell us to give up. But God often works in the silence, shaping strength where the world sees weakness and hope where others see the end. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who may be walking through darkness. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. Your words may be the encouragement someone else needs today. And if you believe in quiet miracles, second chances, and unseen grace, please subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need them most. May God bless you, protect your path, and bring peace to your heart wherever you are watching from.